Website Statista.com reports that the conflict in Ukraine has seen over 6,430 civilian casualties, as well as over 320 foreign companies withdrawing from Russia altogether. The only question is, why did this happen? Today I will talk about and explain the invasion of Ukraine and the different elements that led to its occurrence. I believe that I am well equipped to provide you with this information due to the time I invested researching this matter. I believe that you can benefit from listening to this speech because you are a U.S. citizen and the U.S. is involved in this conflict. The three topics I will inform you about are the recent history between Russia and Ukraine, how the conflict began, and the impact of this war. Now that I previewed what we'll cover, let's move on to the next point. Ukraine is a country with a complicated history closely intertwined with that of Russia's. According to an article called Ukraine's Fraught Relationship with Russia, A Brief History, Ukraine is one of Russia's biggest markets for natural gas exports. It's a crucial transit route to the rest of Europe and home to an estimated 7.5 million ethnic Russians who are mostly located on the eastern part of Ukraine, which borders Russia. The same article explains that in 1991, 90% of Ukrainians voted to declare independence from the crumbling Soviet Union. However, despite their independence, Russia continued to meddle with the country's affairs through the backing of pro-Russian candidates in Ukrainian politics. The biggest conflict between Russia and Ukraine was Crimea. Crimea was a Soviet-controlled territory which was passed to the independent country Ukraine after its fall. Russia felt that the territory rightfully belonged to them, which created a great amount of tension between the two countries. Now that I've covered some of the recent history between these two countries, let me explain how the conflict began. The current war between Russia and Ukraine can be traced back to 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and backed separatist militia in the Donbass region in Ukraine. CBSNews.com further explains how in 2015 a peace deal largely ended major battles, but the fighting has continued since then. Putin invaded once again in February of this year, claiming that his main goal was to demilitarize and liberate the Donbass region from Ukrainian control, due to the large number of ethnic Russians that live in the area. The article also mentions that another reason why Putin began this invasion was to keep Ukraine, the second largest country on the continent, from making common cause with the democracies of Europe. Despite Ukraine not being a part of NATO or being a significant trading partner to the US involved itself in this conflict, which according to NPR.org is because the US felt that the war was morally wrong as well as a disturbance to peace in Europe. Having covered the history between these two countries, as well as having explained the conflict, let us move on to the impact of this war. This war has displaced millions of Ukrainians as well as caused a worsening in hunger in the world's most vulnerable regions. According to an article from Rescue.org, Russian blockades of Ukrainian grain exports have worsened hunger in places such as East Africa and Somalia, which are now teetering on the brink of famine due in part to the 80% reduction in grain imports to those countries. Without urgent international funding, 3 million people in these regions could lose their lives. The conflict has also had a devastating impact on the citizens of Ukraine. The same article explains that innocent civilians have been caught up in the conflict, which has resulted in over 13,000 casualties, including 5,500 killed. There's been catastrophic damage to the infrastructure, especially in eastern Ukraine, where civilian buildings, such as hospitals and schools, have been bombed and destroyed. Now, over 7 million Ukrainians have taken refuge in different parts of Europe. To conclude, I wish to reiterate the different elements that led to the invasion of Ukraine, as well as the conflict itself. We began by discussing the recent history between Russia and Ukraine, in which I explained why Ukraine is so important to Russia, as well as the reasons why tensions have risen since the fall of the Soviet Union. I then explained how the conflict between these two countries began, which covered the annexation of Crimea and the Russian-backed separatist forces in the Donbass region, as well as Putin's attempt to halt Western influence in Ukraine. Lastly, I talked about the impact that this war has had, not just on Ukraine, but in other parts of the world, which included the increased hunger crisis in Somalia and East Africa due to Russian blockades on grain, as well as the displacement of more than 7 million Ukrainians across Europe. Now I've hopefully answered the question I posed in the beginning of this speech, and you have all gained a better understanding of the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Thank you for listening.